MJ.
Carol, okay? Carol?
Yes, it's 9 o'clock.
Okay, I'm starting. Good evening and good morning to all. On behalf of the Philippine Nurses Association of America, we welcome you to the third PNAA webinar on international nurses recruitment. The PNAA Human Rights Committee, in collaboration with the PNAA Global Affairs Committee, is hosting this webinar on resources for newly arrived nurses. I am Marife Sevilla, Chair of the Human Rights Committee, along with Madeline Yu, the Chair of Global Affairs Committee. This webinar will describe the importance of support group for nurses and identify and describe the work of organizations in supporting internationally educated nurses. Along with our topic tonight is the strategies and toolkit for internationally educated Filipino nurses transition to practice in the US, presented by our very own PNAA President, Dr. Gloria Beriones. And now to introduce the panel speakers, may I call on our PNAA immediate past President, Mary Joy Garcia Dia.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I would like to also thank our PNAA webinar series planning committee who has been facilitating this webinar series for the past 2 months. So as a ground rule, this is a webinar format. Only the speakers and moderators are visible on the screen. please use the Q&A section to post your questions. We encourage you to enter your name and state your name, so this way it's easy for us to address your question. And if you want to remain anonymous, it's okay to just enter your initial. And at the end of the webinar, please fill out the evaluation to help us improve our succeeding sessions. So the objectives of this webinar is to describe strategies to promote internationally educated nurses in their transition to the United States, and identify and describe the work of organizations advocating on behalf of internationally educated nurses. Our panel speakers include Dr. Gloria Beriones, who is the PNAA President 2022 to 2024. She is a transformational leader with over 40 years of exemplary contributions to nursing practice. She is a Cold Iron Senior Nurse Executive Fellow at the Cold Iron Shaughnessy Nurse Leader Executive at Case Western Reserve. The next speaker is Attorney Mukul Bakhshi. He is the Chief of Strategy and Government Affairs, CGFNS International, and has served as Director of the Alliance for the International Recruitment Practices. The next speaker is Thomas Álvarez, who is the Senior Research Associate and reports to the President and CEO of CGFNS International. Our third speaker is David Seligman, Executive Director of Towards Justice. And our last speaker is Deborah Schaefer, who is an analyst and investigator at Towards Justice. So we will begin first with Dr. Gloria Beriones.
All right, so next slide, please. So I'm going to share with you the study that I conducted, a qualitative study on the work experiences of internationally educated Filipino nurses in the United States, and my own lived experiences as I am a migrant nurse myself. I want you to know that this article is being published by Nurse Leader, the Journal of the American Organization of Nursing Leadership, which is the voice of nurses in healthcare, made up of 10,000 members who are nurses that facilitate, design, and manage care. Now, these are managers, directors, executive nurse leaders who will read this article coming up January 23 of 2023. So they will really know that what the nurses, the internationally educated nurses, are going through in the process of transition. There is a purpose, passion, and perseverance to come to the United States to make it very successful here, to contribute to the healthcare of our society. There are intrinsic and extrinsic factors that help them to be successful in the transition, and we'll touch on that. But most of all, the need to support is very important. For them to be successful, the internationally educated Filipino nurses newly arrived in the United States need support from family, hospital leaders and management, co-workers, professional organizations like us, the PNAA America, and the local chapters, the community, and the civic organizations such as the PhilAm community. Next slide, please. The intrinsic factors are in the study, they are within themselves determined to learn. They want to continue to learn personal goals that they have. They want to succeed here, coming to the United States, and their strong faith in God. In fact, they go to the chapel, they make a sign of a cross, they go to the chapel to pray, to be guided by the Holy Spirit in order to provide an excellent and safe care and to be successful in their transition to practice. Next slide, please. So what are those extrinsic factors that are environmental to support them to successfully make it well here in the US? And to you newly arrived Filipino educated nurses, remember the support systems they are telling us in the studies are the management, who are the nurse managers, directors, preceptors, educators, co-workers, families, and friends. However, thorough orientation, listen to this. They are stressing to this study that I did, thorough orientation, not just hospital, but the basic in the clinical units and the value of preceptor and the interdisciplinary teamwork that they learn to work with, and then the utilization of evidence-based practice, such as the core measures that they learn, not from textbook alone, but the real implementation at the bedside. And one thing that's very, very clear, passing that state board, the NCLEX, is the translation of what is in theory. Now they see it in real practice here in the United States. Next slide, please. So how do they, what strategies do they use? They look at, they observe, they look at their coworkers. How do they give report? They listen to how they communicate to physicians. What's the intonation? How do they pronounce the words? They ask questions, a lot of questions. So be very attuned to them when they ask questions because they want to know more. To you, when you are transitioning, being a team player means that you are going to work with other members of the team. When you have a positive attitude, other people, other coworkers gravitate to you. So if you are newly arrived, you are positive, you want to learn, you are helping others, you have that really a positive energy to the people around you. More people are going to help you in the process of learning. And then they want to continue to embrace lifelong learning by having to have attending in services at the bedside or conferences, and they build relationships. They are telling in this research study that having that good relationship with their coworkers build their confidence. They're able to get good tactics, ways of doing good evidence-based practice from the coworkers because they have that relationship, a helping hands to them because they have that positive attitude. But at the end of the day, self-reflection. What they're telling me at this study is, at the end of the day, I always ask myself, what really matters here? What worked and what did not work for me? What was so important to the patients? What was the preference of this patient? They learn along the way. So pay attention to this when you are transitioning to your practice. What matters to you and what matters to others. Next page, please. So the toolkit that we wanted you to learn is the US healthcare institution should provide institutional, really good orientation, but when they go to the units, give them a very good orientation as well. Don't shortcut their orientation. Learn how to do the US customs. As you are transitioning, know the US, what are those, like their celebrations. Thanksgiving is big to the American people. 4th of July, the language. How do you pronounce those words? And we'll touch base to that. Effective communication and assertiveness. But the most valuable materials that I've learned when I was in Tennessee as an educator, they were having a lot of problems with the slang words. For example, the words chill, laid back. They didn't understand that, and they quiver, and they said, what is that? Idiomatic expressions such as hands on deck. The jargon says drill down. What is that? I don't understand those words. One internationally educated nurse came up to me and said, Tita Glo, help me. I don't understand these words being utilized. So I printed all the slang words, created that as part of their packet when they are in orientation. So what is really bothering them is the use of this equipment. So pay attention to this. Hands-on practice. Hands-on practice to the equipment and machines that are learned in textbooks and journal, now in real practice, such as Álvarez pumps for the IV, the feeding pumps such as kangaroo. We didn't have that in the Philippines. Respiratory equipments as CPAP, BiPAP, ventilators are different kinds, as well as wound vacs. Whoa, big time for them. So hands-on is so important. And my hope that the article that's coming up January 23 to the nurse managers who are receiving 10,000 nurse managers, executive boards are receiving these articles because of the nurse leaders journal, will read this article and will hear your way of transitioning safely to the bedside. Next slide, please. In addition, welcoming and supporting unit leadership managers has to be very big. So when you have a Filipino nurse there on the unit, utilizing them, get you yourself, find out who is a Filipino nurse here, because it makes you feel comfortable to be that big brother or a big sister. And then monthly informal meetings to know what are the concerns and to alleviate their concerns by providing them resources. I want to share a good story here. When I was in Tennessee, one of the agencies that brought 20 nurses in the hospital where I was the manager of education met with us every other month during the day, and at night they took these nurses for dinner. So we really had a connection of what are those that concerns the nurses, the Filipino nurses at the bedside, and then they took them to dinner during nighttime. So what a beautiful concept of connecting to the Filipino nurses who are transitioning to practice. And the other part of this toolkit is really having the internationally educated Filipino nurses introduce them to the local chapters of the Philippine Nurses of America. This is a powerful part of the research study that came out of my study. And I hope that the 10,000 members of this nurse leader that will read this article will help them to become a member of a local chapter across the country, because this is what the Filipino nurses who were part of this study said. Connect them because they will help them to transition to practice. Why? They will get to know how to know the city where they are, the culture, as well as the best practice in a safe transition to the American way of nursing practice. Next slide, please. The educators, preceptors, managers, they have to meet weekly with this preceptee, who is the Filipino American nurse who is transitioning to practice. Look at the milestone, the progress, and areas of opportunity. Colleagues and other healthcare disciplines learning about them so that they feel they belong. The feeling of belongingness is important in the process of transition. And you, as Filipino nurses transitioning to the American culture, get to know the culture as well of your other internationally educated nurses. It could be an Indian, could be Chinese, or the American nurses, or the Black nurses. Get to know them well. And the support and mentoring of the experienced internationally educated Filipino nurses. This is the key. If you have a Filipino nurse on the unit, help them know the new Filipino nurse, put them under your wings so that they will feel comfortable. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, any internationally educated nurses, including myself, when I first came to the US, regardless of age, gender, education level, prior experience, or type of healthcare institution, every international Filipino nurse will face a significant challenges transitioning to the nursing practice. I want everybody who is reading this article and who is listening to this, they need a lot of support in the process of their transition. It is the resolve of the nurse, whoever is the internationally educated nurse. Listen to this, be positive, look at yourself, what you bring in, you want it to succeed, then do your very best. But they also need the support of the institution, the nurse, the nurses, the co-workers, and the hospital themselves. It takes a lot to bring them to be very successful. So I will leave at that, and then I will give the baton to the next speaker, Attorney Mukul and Mr. Thomas.
Great, thank you so much, Gloria, for that wonderful discussion. You know, it's always an honor to come speak with the PNAA and the members here. It is an organization, and I think those of you who are just entering the workforce, to have that resource, people who've been through this experience and can really give good advice, is just an excellent experience. And so we're very happy to have had a partnership with PNAA for all these years, and had members including Gloria and Mary Joy on our board in the recent past, and other supporters on this call as well. Next slide, Thomas. So, Mary Joy did a great job of introducing us. I am the Chief of Strategy and Government Affairs at CGFNS. Before that, I've been in CGFNS a much longer time. I am the Director of the Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices, which I'll talk about in a moment. I also have on the call with me Thomas Álvarez, who is on the Government Affairs team at CGFNS as the Global Affairs and Policy Specialist. Next slide. I think many of you know CGFNS. CGFNS has been around for 46 years now, and we do things including the visa screen program for immigration to the United States, as well as our programs for state licensure for foreign educated nurses who want to get licensed in the United States. But at the highest level, I think of CGFNS as helping professionals, including Filipino nurses, bring and use their education experience across borders. So by doing our credential evaluations, we're able to facilitate mobility so that Filipino nurses can bring their incredible skill sets to serve patients in the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. So if you think of CGFNS as kind of being the bridge of allowing people to be mobile, the Alliance is kind of the flip side of that. So the Alliance has a code of ethical recruitment. And when people are moving across borders, we want to make sure that it's happening as fairly and ethically as possible, as defined by the voluntary code. CGFNS, PNAA, many other organizations across the sector helped establish the Alliance back in 2008. In 2014, the Alliance became a division of CGFNS. Next slide. And there's a whole bigger global piece here, right? So when we're talking about people in mobility, the PNAA has really been at the vanguard, for decades in terms of promoting this, really the start. But now, there's a much broader discussion around what mobility looks like for healthcare professionals and for others. And so what you see here is that there are kind of a bunch of different kind of approaches. So on the left side, you have what I call non-sector specific approaches. So these are things like the UN in 2018 adopted the Global Compact for Migration, which was the first kind of effort to look at migration holistically and make sure it's as safe and orderly as possible. The International Organization for Migration and the International Labor Organization all have initiatives to help promote ethical recruitment to make sure that when people are going across borders, it's as fair as possible. On the right side, you see the World Health Organization, right, which I think many of you have heard of. They have a code of global practice. And that code, which I've had the kind of privilege of helping to advance on some of their expert advisory groups, is kind of designed at the member state level. It tells countries how to look at recruitment and to make sure it's fair as possible. So there are things like, what are the bilateral agreements between Philippines and other countries like Germany to make sure that when people are coming over, there are provisions in place to support them. And then on the bottom, you have the alliance, right? So the alliance is kind of, if these other initiatives are top down, the alliance is really bottoms up. And so it's groups like PNAA and unions and recruiters and employers coming together and saying, some of us are pro-immigration, some of us are anti, some of us, have a business interest in migration, others have a kind of a humanitarian interest in making sure people are supported. Regardless of that, what is the common ground we can all agree on? Well, it's that recruitment's happening and that we want it to be fair and ethical as possible. And that is how the code is kind of providing rights and responsibilities for the Filipino nurse or any other foreign educated nurse, for the recruiter, and for the healthcare facility in which that nurse might work. Next slide. So I kind of gave a high level introduction to this already, but I do want to jump into the code for a moment. So what is the code, right? It's the healthcare code. You can find it on our website. I know Thomas is going to drop a link in a moment. It's a voluntary agreement, so there's no requirement here, but it sets best practice standards to guide the fair and ethical recruitment of foreign educated and internationally educated health professionals to the United States. So why do we need the code? Well, back when the Alliance was created in 2008, there were lots of nurses coming over to the US. And what was very clear, and kind of Gloria also made some of similar points that are kind of very similar to 15 years later, was that healthcare professionals, including nurses, do not always understand their legal obligations and rights. And so that could lead to signing contracts that aren't in their best interest. And so the goal here is to make sure that stakeholders, including the nurse, but also the recruiters and the employers, really benefit when everybody's expectations are aligned and when individuals have an independent resource to go to for advice. And so that's what this webinar today is really about. Groups like the Alliance and of course the PNAA and some of the other speakers as well. What are the resources that nurses have when you come here? This is not a new path, and so finding the resources to help you navigate decisions is very helpful. And the code addresses kind of very key points. So, what are the rights and responsibilities of the migrant nurse? What is the recruiter and employer accountability? How do you access justice when there are problems there? The right to move freely without coercion. So one of the major issues we often talk about, and which I know Thomas will talk about in a moment, is the idea of, what happens if you need to leave a contract? And then finally, as Gloria was talking about, the real importance of not just clinical integration, but also cultural integration to make sure that you're part of the workforce and the communities in which you live. Next slide. So the Alliance really seeks to inform and empower professionals to make informed career decisions. And so we do many things to help highlight where people are going. So nurses and other health professionals come to the Alliance as a confidential third party to discuss their employment and recruitment. We're not lawyers for you. We're more resources that can help kind of navigate your issue, kind of explain your rights, and explain if an attorney might be helpful. And so we have multiple resources to help. So we monitor the landscape. So we answer inquiries from nurses seeking to migrate to the US from around the world, including many, many from the Philippines. We stay in close contact with international recruiters, including those who choose to get certified under our certification process, as well as some of the other large recruiters that have not been certified. We create recent research and we provide resources, and this includes the nurse migration report that we just recently did on trends on healthcare migration to the US, and I shout out for the PNAA's handbook for Filipino nurses immigrating to the US, which provides a kind of a full comprehensive how-to on what to be looking out for and how to make sure your integration into the US nursing workforce is as seamless as possible. And then finally, we do a pre-certification survey. And many of you who were at the International Nursing Conference last year might recall, this is kind of an innovative approach fostered by groups like the PNAA to understand what the experience of nurses looks like. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Thomas, to continue the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Mukul, for that intro on the Alliance. I'm going to talk to you all today about our pre-certification survey and some of the results that we found. So I'll start by saying that this survey, as Mukul noted, it's a required step for recruitment firms who are seeking certification from the Alliance. And what's really beneficial for us is that it provides us critical data on the individual nurses' experiences. So I'll start with kind of overviewing what the survey looks like. It was founded 2 years ago in 2020, and since we released it initially, we've received over 4,000 responses. More specifically, it is a 23-question survey. It's a combination of multiple choice and free response questions, and it takes about 5 minutes to answer. One thing we also wanted to note is that this survey is completely confidential and that individual data will never be shared with a recruitment agency without the prior consent of the respondent. So additionally to this, respondents can indicate that they would like to follow up with an Alliance staff member to further discuss the recruitment journey or any other specific issues that they have with their recruitment firm. So here are the demographics from our most recent survey released in 2021. As you can see, nurses educated in the Philippines made up nearly 50% of all of the respondents. This was followed after by Kenyan educated nurses at 25%, Indian, Jamaican, and Nigerian nurses. These demographics are quite on par with kind of our understanding at CGFNS of the internationally educated nursing workforce in the United States. In 2022, of all of the CGFNS visa screen applications received, over 60% were educated in the Philippines. 60% of those nurses and healthcare professionals were educated in the Philippines. So while overall the survey responses were positive, there were a few areas of concern that we noted to increase our awareness and really drive our work as we look to 2023 and beyond. So I'll begin with the positive. Over 90% of respondents reported either a positive or a very positive experience with the recruitment journey. So this came from the question, how would you rate your overall experience with your recruiter? Respondents could answer very positive, positive, neutral, negative, and very neutral. However, when asked about the first year breach fee, which is the fee associated with breaking your contract within the first year, 37% of respondents said they were not aware of this or that they did not know. Now, more interestingly, some of the free responses that we received, they showed increased confusion about contract length specifically. So these are two issues that we identified from the survey, and we're going to look at increasing our resources to help nurses in the future with these issues. So here's a quick look at some of the more broader trends from our survey. As you can see, over 90% of respondents noted that 1, they received a copy of their contract, 2, they were able to review their contract before signing, and 3, were aware of their hourly wage prior to arrival. At the same time, just over half of the respondents knew which state their job would be located in, and less than half were aware of the Alliance prior to taking our survey. So again, these last 2 points are something we'll be looking at moving forward and that we hope to improve in the next year. So I want to talk briefly about what is the real impact of the survey, kind of what are we hoping to get from these results. So I would say the impact is multifaceted. Firstly, nurse inquiries and survey responses provide us insight into the real impacts of recruitment practices on individual nurses and on their families. Secondly, these responses inform and direct our work at the Alliance by suggesting which resources would be most beneficial for internationally educated nurses. Thirdly, and most importantly, this pre-certification survey serves as a critical check on the recruitment agencies, enabling us to check the validity of their ethical practices, which they claim during the certification process. So now I just want to touch briefly on a few of the resources that the Alliance offers, apart from this survey, intended to help internationally educated nurses who are migrating to the United States. So I'll start with this, our recent guide for health professionals seeking work in the United States was released this previous year. And it was really formed from some of the top questions, the frequently asked questions that we receive from the nurses that we work with. I would say it covers three main points. The first being it offers key questions that nurses should be considering as they begin their migration process. So this can include basic US immigrants and immigration information, a more detailed explanation of the typical recruitment model and process, and then also some recruitment red flags that one should be looking out for. Secondly, this guide provides information on our Alliance certified recruitment firms. So we connect interested nurses with direct website links, contact information, points of contact, as well as any regional specialties that these firms may have implemented. And while many of these resources do already exist for internationally educated nurses, this guide is intended to act as a standalone guide, but also we wanted to kind of direct nurses to organizations and to additional resources that do already exist. So what I want to note here was mentioned a few times in this webinar thus far is the PNAA handbook, which is something that we love to promote to the nurses that we work with. Two more resources that we've produced in the last year. The first being a set of quick guides for internationally educated nurses and also for employers in the United States who are planning to work with this group. There's the first guide is an explanation on the process of becoming a US health professional. And the second overviews the benefits of working with an Alliance certified firm. So again, this is for both the nurse and for employers to show the benefits. A second resource, which is you can find on the CGFNS International blog website, is called the Migrating to the US series. And it provides a short overview of some of the key questions that we've identified from nurses migrating to the United States, such as understanding their recruitment options, again, highlighting some of the key red flags associated with recruitment, and also top 3 contract review questions that they may have. I will end with some notable research that we wanted to highlight. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 year of the nurse really elevated nursing into the global spotlight. And as a result, we've seen an increase in research and available data on nursing and nurse migration. So the first, Mukul mentioned this earlier, I'll note it again, and I will also be sharing in the chat after this, is our CGFNS Nurse Migration Report, which is based on our yearly visa screen program data, which is nurses and healthcare professionals migrating to the United States. And it covers data points such as the top sending countries, the top countries of education, top education levels, and the most popular US states destination in which nurses seek licensure. One final resource is a report by the International Center on Nurse Migration, which is a collaboration between CGFNS and the International Council of Nurses. And they focused on tangential goals on how countries can create better policies to support nurses. And then they also focus on shifting the narrative to focus more on staff retention and also ethical recruitment. So with that, I will turn it back to Mukul.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Nursing communities, including, of course, the Filipino American and Filipino educated nurse community, is really increased attention on migration and focus on ethical recruitment is very much increasing. And so I want to close. I see there's phenomenal questions in the chat. I guess we'll address those questions during the Q&A. But at the highest level, access to resources is a very important part of a fair recruitment process. The recruitment agencies have shown increasing interest in partnering with the Alliance over the last few years, both to develop additional guides and to ensure that nurses who are coming understand their commitments. I think we can have a more discussion in the in the Q&A, but I do think there are a lot of trade-offs here, right? The model leaves people very vulnerable fundamentally. And so we're trying to kind of ameliorate that by creating an additional resource. But I think there are questions about, you know, some of the kind of the long-term contracts, what they mean, and certainly, you know, things that we don't standardly see or regularly see, but do see occasionally, including contract substitution, and, you know, things like that that are very much an issue. So looking forward to discussing that during the Q&A. But I do think, you know, one of the key things is webinars like this that make it very clear, you know, that there are resources out there, and that the more you know earlier, the better off you are, right? So if a contract cannot be signed in the first place, that can avoid a lot of problems later on. And this goes to the fact that nursing organizations like PNAA are uniquely positioned to provide effective guidance, right? Whether it be the research you all do, the human rights committee's incredible work, having the privilege of working with them for so long, and then you know, things like this mentoring program that I'm just hearing about, that sounds like an incredible resource. Those are all tools to make that much easier. And it's not just PNAA, you know, things like the fact that the Philippine Overseas Labor Office, POLO, is another resource as well. And the Alliance, we hope that we can continue to create and connect resources to the nurses who need them as they transition to working in the US. And not just coming to the US, but also as problems arise throughout the contract, right? As many of you know, these are often, you know, 3-year contracts. And so a lot can change during that time. And so having organizations like the Alliance and PNAA and others on this call and not on this call today, I think is very key to making sure that you're ultimately successful as a nurse and as a person integrating to the US. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mukul and Thomas. We will now turn over towards Attorney David Seligman and Deborah Schaefer.
Thank you. Hi, and can you hear me okay? Is it okay? Wonderful, thank you. And my colleague, Deborah Schaefer, will also be joining into the conversation. So Deb and I work for an organization called Towards Justice. We don't have, we're a nonprofit legal organization based in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, but we support workers around the country. We don't have a PowerPoint to share with you today, and I think we're going to keep the presentation relatively brief. But because I agree with McCall, I see some great questions. I'd love to be able to get to them, but we wanted to talk a little bit about the work we do and how we may serve as a resource, and talk to you in very broad strokes, very generally, about some of the legal issues that we see coming up for nurses once they're in the United States. Let me say it's really an honor to be invited here today to speak on this webinar. I've been representing, as a lawyer, I've been representing nurses, in particular nurses from the Philippines now for several years, and the work that we're doing on behalf of nurses is some of the most fulfilling of my entire career. In particular, let me say that the work that the PNAA is doing and the other organizations we've heard from to empower nurses, to hear their voices, help support them and give them resources is critically important. Because I think that this way of building power and giving voice to workers generally and to you in particular is absolutely essential to leveling the playing field and making things more fair. Towards Justice, as I said, we're a nonprofit legal organization. We've represented nurses now for several years. Most of the cases in which we've represented international nurses, many of them from the Philippines, involve situations in which nurses have come to the United States and the working conditions that they've experienced in the United States aren't at all what they expected. They feel underpaid. They feel like they're working in very dangerous working conditions. Especially now, they feel like they are subject to really dangerous staffing ratios. They're required to treat far too many patients. many of our clients and others we've heard from get to a point where they're concerned about their license, right? Because they have worked so hard to become a nurse and an expert and want to do right by their patients, right? But feel like it's impossible to do right by their patients if they're treating 40 or 50 nurses at a time, or just patients at a time. Unfortunately, there are some companies, there are some employers, and I'm not saying that this is all employers of nurses from the Philippines or all employers of nurses, but there are some employers who can exploit nurses and exploit the immigration and recruitment systems in order to take advantage of the really expert, very high quality work which foreign nurses and Filipino nurses can perform, and pay those nurses less than they're entitled to, less than they should be entitled to if we were operating in a competitive and fair market, and require them to do more work than they should, to treat more patients than they should be required to treat. Confident that those nurses will not leave their jobs, right? Because of the threat of consequences for leaving their contract. So that's deeply problematic and raises a number of legal issues that we've supported nurses with. So I think that the sort of one of the fundamental foundations, one of the tenets of American law and the labor market, right, in the United States, is that the way to keep workers in their jobs, right, is to pay them decent wages and treat them well, right? That's how you retain workers, right? You treat them well, right? And if you don't treat them well, then they go work somewhere else, right? Like the threat of being able to go work somewhere else, that is absolutely essential to fair treatment on the job. Far too many nurses have been stripped of that right unfairly, and very often we think illegally. So I wanted to talk about sort of at a very high level, some of the sort of 3 key legal problems that we see coming up in this context. But before we get there, I think I just want to start with a sort of a critical observation that is something that is a key point of confusion that we come across very often with nurses and with workers generally, and with foreign nurses in particular. We hear very often that people will say to us, describe unfair treatment that seems to them like it should be illegal, but they'll say, oh, there's nothing I can do about this because I signed a contract. And that's a really very common misconception about how law in the United States works. They say, you'll hear people say, I signed a contract and therefore there's nothing I can do. This is not to say that you shouldn't be very careful before signing a contract to read it and understand it and try as much as you can to have a good idea of what sort of circumstances you may be entering. But just because you signed a contract doesn't mean that that everything in the contract is legal, and doesn't mean that everything that's happening to you under that contract is legal. And so we encourage you, even if you signed a contract, even if you knew what you were signing, we encourage you to talk to us, to talk to other resources if you're being treated unfairly. You still have a voice, right? You still have rights, even if you signed a contract. So one of the key legal problems that we see involves what the law refers to as labor trafficking, which I think is a concept that I've seen some questions about in the chat. In the United States, it is illegal to coerce someone, to keep someone trapped in a job through the threat of serious harm, or what we call the abuse of legal process. And courts have said consistently that serious harm can include the threat of paying a steep financial penalty. We see penalties into the tens of thousands, into the very high 5 figures and even 6 figures for nurses for leaving a job early, just because there's a contract there allowing an employer to collect large amounts of money for leaving a job. That doesn't mean that that the contract is legal, and doesn't mean that the contract doesn't involve labor trafficking. It's illegal to require people to recruit indentured servants and keep them trapped in a job through the threat of serious harm, right? And the threat of serious financial penalties can begin to look like indentured servitude, right? At certain points when the job is especially in certain circumstances in which the job doesn't line up with the expectations of the worker. We also run into lots of cases involving fraud, fraud directed toward nurses, right? Where there are lies, for example, about what kinds of working conditions workers will experience in the United States, about where they'll be placed, about what's in a contract, and sometimes fraud directed toward immigration authorities in the United States. So, for example, the visas the green card visas that most of our clients are recruited under require that they be employed in full-time permanent employment. But we've seen far too many cases in which nurses are brought into the United States and then not given a job for many months sometimes, right? During that period, they're still subject to breach fees, which may be illegal, that prevent them from finding other work, right? So we think is inconsistent with the principles of full-time and permanent employment, and could be illegal. And last, in addition to, I mentioned one of the key pieces of the labor market and the labor law in the United States is that you should be able to leave your job if you're not treated well and paid decent wages. In addition to that, another key tenet of the labor laws is that your employer pays for the cost of doing business and not the worker paying for the cost of doing business. So employers cannot require workers to kick back to them, right, to pay them back, right, for costs that the employer should bear, for the employer's own costs of doing business. So we think that this could involve cases in which it could be legal, for example, for an employer to require a nurse to pay back the cost of a flight to the United States, right? But it's very different, we think, for the employer to say, you have to pay us back for our lost profits, tens of thousands of dollars if you leave a job. That's not the kind of thing that the minimum wage laws in the United States allow. So these are just some of the problems that we see. I think that the key thing that we want to leave you with today, and these are all involved really complicated questions of law, and it's not your job to understand all of them, right? I want to be very clear about that. The key thing that I want to highlight to you is that we're here for you, and we want to hear from you. We're going to share our website and contact information, and if you have questions, we're available for free and confidential legal intakes in which we can provide you with advice and support, totally free. But your voice is so important. Working together with the PNAA is so important. And it's making a difference, right? People are hearing this perspective and the perspective of nurses, and they're responding. So for just the Federal Trade Commission, just 2 days ago, proposed a new rule which would prohibit non-compete agreements affecting, that would affect nurses and doctors. And in their proposed rule, they highlight that the threat of financial penalties, that's a non-compete agreement, right? Because it keeps people trapped in their jobs, right? So which would, I think, reach many of the practices that we find most concerning. They propose that rule because they've heard from nurses like you, right? So I know that there's so much more that I'd like to say, but I think that the key thing I want to leave you with is that we're here for you, and continue to speak out and find support, especially from all of the organizations you've heard from today. And Deb, I think my colleague is on the call too. Deb, I just see myself right now.
Oh, okay. David, I think I did want to add one more thing. Hello, everybody. So I'm not an attorney, I'm an investigator for our office. So I do a lot of initial interviews with nurses that are reaching out to us with questions about their legal rights, their working conditions, and what they're experiencing. Like sometimes people are quite distressed. Sometimes they just want a little bit more information about their contract or how their work experience differs from what they were told when they were recruited. One of the things that has come up that I would like to highlight is that in the United States, you have a right to talk about your compensation with other workers. So that could be American workers working at the same facility that you're working at. It also could be other workers at your same staffing company or recruitment agency. And so sometimes nurses will say things that are like, you know, I don't know what other people were making. I'm not sure what other contracts said because I knew that was illegal to ask about. And in the United States, you have a right to talk with other workers about your working conditions. So, David, do you want to say anything more about that?
That's a great point, Deb. I do want to emphasize that because I think that is a problem that we run into very often with nurses. It contributes to feelings of isolation, right? And it contributes to feelings of that there's nothing that I can do here, right? I'm alone. There's nothing I can do here, and my mistreatment is just about me, and it's not about everybody else, right? You have a right to talk to each other, and that includes for others you're working alongside. It's a staffing agency context. Others who are American nurses working alongside you. You can talk to them about how much you're making, right, and about how much they're making. It's your employer is prohibited from preventing you from doing that. So it is illegal for your employer to prevent you from doing that. I think that talking to each other and the misconception that you're not allowed to talk to each other, I think can be really dangerous and add to these feelings of isolation. I think that's an excellent point, Deb. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think I'll share our contact information in the chat now, but I don't think I have anything else to add. So thank you, everyone. Oh, and well, there's a comment right now, David. Can you just say one more thing about retaliation? There's something in the chat where someone said people are afraid of retaliation. Can you just say like one more little bit about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is illegal for your boss to retaliate against you for speaking out about being about your pay or mistreatment at work, right? As a general matter, right? It is illegal for your boss to retaliate against you for those things, for speaking out about potentially unfair or illegal treatment, especially if you're doing it alongside or in conjunction with other workers. There's lots of laws that type of conduct implicates, including laws that protect your right to join a union, and protections against retaliation for speaking out about minimum wage violations, for example. I also know that it's very easy for lawyers to say it's against the law for your employer to do this to you. When workers call us, they're calling us because they think that their boss is violating the law, right? And so it's small comfort to hear that it would be illegal for your boss to retaliate. So we understand that it's very difficult to do that. And if you have questions about, your rights under the retaliation laws or about what's happening to you at work, we encourage you to call us. We know that it can be challenging and intimidating, but you do have a voice and you do have rights.
And I think the last thing I would add is when you're talking to an attorney or if you call our office, that is a protected call. And so your information remains confidential. And sometimes when people are quite scared, it can be comforting to hear that we are obligated to keep your information confidential. And we serve all the states in the United States. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. And I will turn this over to Madeline, you and Emily, who are moderating the Q&A. Go ahead, Madeline.
Good morning. Mayong aga from Iloilo, Philippines. The PNAA is functioning globally. Our executive director is listening to us from India. So maayong aga and welcome everybody. And as previously announced by Dr. Mary Joy Garcia Dia, we would love if you could kindly identify yourself. So looking at the Q&As, I would love to introduce my co-chair first, Em.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good morning to whoever's in the Philippines. I'm Emily Danuco. I'm the co-chair of Global Affairs Committee. Welcome.
Thanks, Em. So I will read the identified person first, from Roberto San Diego to Mukul. What happens when someone brings to your attention that one of the members of your alliance, a recruiter, has a pending complaint in the Philippine Overseas Labor Office Migrant Workers Office in Washington, D.C. What if the complaint involves a possible violation of Trafficking Victims and Protection Act in the U.S. and the trafficking laws in the Philippines? Mukul?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think one of the tough things for us at the Alliance is we're multi-stakeholder. So we're taking the recruiters, the employers, the unions, groups like PNAA, and taking it all together. And so, one of the challenges for an organization like us is, are we trying to, kind of make get rid of the bad actors and, show who the bad actors are, the good actors, or, there's all fundamental problems with the business model that can be there too. And so, when we often refer people to Polo if there are questions or issues where we think it's appropriate to make that referral. On our own, we wouldn't, a Polo complaint would not trigger our compliance process. A nurse would need to separately report a complaint under our compliance process for a recruiter, and then we would process that through that. So we've had pretty good luck processing, kind of complaints confidentially that nurses have made. We would always, of course, offer the ability to go public, but that has not been necessary at this point. So I think, when you're talking to an organization like Towards Justice, if there's, things that there are complaints, but sometimes if you prefer to kind of work within a recruiter's office, you can use a complaint through us. So I think having both options is really helpful for nurses when there are problems.
Thank you, Mukul. M?
Our next question is from Attorney Kellum, actually, and this is for Thomas, Mr. Thomas Álvarez. Do you inquire if nurses are given multiple contracts or conflicting contracts to sign before their immigration interview?
Yeah, I'll answer on behalf of Thomas on that. I think we don't ask the question explicitly in our survey. So those of you who've answered the survey, it's about a couple dozen questions. We have had to leave a lot out to keep the survey as short as possible. So the goal is to ask as few questions so that we get answers, versus if we ask too many, we lose people in the process. We do hear about that, either through our follow-up interviews or through the free response questions. It's not incredibly common. It's prohibited by our code for certified recruiters. And so if there are any certified recruiters who are doing that, we should know immediately, because we would want to raise that with them. It's prohibited by our code. We do, of course, know about that existing for those that aren't part of our certification process. And unfortunately, that is more common than it should be for staffing firms and placement firms.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Mukul.
Attorney.
So from Angela Stevens, she asks, from the perspective of a foreign graduate seeking employment overseas, how do they avail themselves of these resources? I would imagine resources from CGFNS or from Attorney Seligman's services. Anybody?
So I think I would start with saying, I think the CGFNS resources and the PNAA resources are probably, the best early on in the process. Lots of questions around, how to navigate the process, what are you looking for, all of that stuff. And then I think I'll let David kind of conclude, but I would say that, if there are problems that arise, there are multiple resources. So there's the PNAA Human Rights Committee. Polo, of course, has a labor attaché that can help navigate things. The Alliance is useful, particularly if you're working with a certified firm, because we can directly raise your complaint at the highest levels and often get those kind of solved quietly. And then, if none of that works or doesn't, or you want some additional legal advice, then going to a group like Toward Justice can make a lot of sense as well. David, do you? Thoughts on that?
That's yeah.
We can't hear you.
Apologies, sorry. We're very interested in talking.
Your audio, I think there's a problem with your audio, Attorney.
Yeah, your audio's doing something real funny.
I can.
There it is. You're good now.
Okay.
There, you're good.
Sorry. We're very interested in talking to anyone who has concern, but I think that.
We lost you again, attorney.
Probably better. It's probably easier back.
Yeah.
Once you're experiencing problems.
Okay, I believe Attorney Seligman is experiencing some audio issues. Let's move on to the next one. And
Yeah. So
Okay.
Madeline, before we proceed, I just want to add also, because the question is specific to resources, how do they reach out? And I know that Emily is the membership chair. We do have over 50 plus chapters all across the United States, local PNAA chapters. And these are resources that are familiar with what we are talking about here in terms of resources. And each of these governance within the local chapter know how to navigate and help you along to reach out to the appropriate individuals or organizations that we can connect for referrals.
thank you, Dr. Dia. Again, PNAA is at your service, and we are 55 chapters all across the United States. So moving on, I believe this is addressed also to Alliance. McCall, what measures does Alliance have in place to perform site visits, international visits, to make sure regarding the validity of practices by recruitment firms from SM?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I would say we have some tools, but not enough, right? So we, our biggest kind of way to assure that company's doing what it says is we look at the contract itself, and we review all the contracts and any ancillary documents that are signed to make sure they comply with our code. And then we use the survey and references to validate that. I visited the largest recruiter, so I think, you know, in that sense, I think if you're working with certified recruiter, you certainly have that kind of protection. I will say, you know, if they're smaller recruiters or often they're third party recruiters, then there can be issues as well. So, you know, I think we're trying to do more to kind of validate that firms are doing what they say they're doing. I think the largest firms by and large are. So, you know, I think obviously we have more resources. It would be great to do more diligence as well.
Thank you, Mukul. M?
And the next question, I think, sounds like a follow-up question to that, also for Alliance. Does the Alliance reach out to agencies that are not registered with the Alliance to provide a value proposition on advantages of being part of the Alliance? This is from MM.
Yeah, great question. So you know, there's been a lot of shift in the last few years. So about, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, about 10 to 15% of nurses coming to the United States were coming through Alliance certified firms. Today, it's probably just over 50% of nurses are coming through Alliance certified firms. So the largest, you know, some of the largest firms are certified today. We often try to get more firms certified. I think the real positive for them is to differentiate themselves. This is an industry with a lot of different players. Some of them are relatively good actors. Some of them are, you know, very problematic. And so their desire to differentiate themselves is very important. But on the other side, you know, I think there's a lot of kind of administrative oversight that's required. That's been an issue to get firms certified. So hopefully, I think one of the biggest drivers is when nurses ask about Alliance certification and when hospitals ask about it. So when there's a clear value proposition for them that you're able to recruit nurses more effectively and you're able to get contracts with hospitals more effectively, I think that would be very useful for that. But in the meanwhile, a lot of the kind of value proposition is just differentiating yourself as opposed to kind of measurable improvements in business.
Thank you, Mukul. Now, the next question is from one of our PNAA leaders from the West, Lourdes Moldre. She asks, where are the top clinical settings, inpatient, outpatient, that are successfully recruiting Filipino-educated nurses? I wonder if there's a list somewhere. Maybe Dr. Beriones, can you address this? Dr. Beriones?
I'd repeat the question again.
Oh, Lourdes is asking if where are the top clinical settings, inpatient or outpatient, who are successfully recruiting Filipino-educated nurses?
It's the inpatient right now. more so than ambulatory or outpatient. It's the inpatient.
And I would like to add also that majority of the trend that we have includes more of the nursing home, skilled nursing facilities.
Thank you, Dr. Beriones, Dr. Mary Joy Garcia Dia, and we can expound some more on that answer in our FAQs that we will be distributing to you. Thank you. So next question, Em.
This is for Dr. Beriones. Will the published article be open access?
Yes, right. Yes, right now, go to Elsevier online. You can read it.
Thank you, Dr. Beriones.
You're welcome.
Questions for Attorney Seligman. Discuss or advice for nurses that are given 3-year work terms by recruiter, but at will contracts by employer or petitioner. Do we still have Attorney Seligman?
Oh, can you hear me now? Is this good?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry about that. I switched over to the phone. So I assume that the question is in the context of there could be two different possibilities here for what might be happening. One might be with like a direct hire recruiter where there's a recruitment agency that places someone with an employer in the United States, and the contract with the employer is different from the contract with the recruiter. It's very hard, and I understand this is an annoying very lawyerly answer. It's very hard to say exactly how that situation, how the law would be applied to that particular context. I think my instinct is that as a general matter, that the contract, and we'd have to read both contracts, but that the contract with the employer would trump the contract with the recruiter. That's the employment contract that sets out the employment term. But I would have to read the contract with the recruiter to see precisely what was in that contract.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this next question is also for you, Attorney Seligman. How can one respond to the argument of brain drain in terms of international recruitment from SS?
My apologies. I'm not totally sure I understand the question. So if other panelists have a sense, I'd be very happy to provide any insights I might have, but others might have a better idea.
Yeah, I can take a cut at that. So, I think one of the key kind of questions, and, Gloria and Mary Joy and I have grappled quite a bit with this question in the context of the Alliance and some of the work there, is there's kind of, what does ethical recruitment mean, right? So at the macro level, obviously there are source countries like the Philippines and other countries that have a need for more healthcare resources. And so when, people are leaving there's a cost obviously to the source country. On the other hand, individuals have the right to make the best decisions for their careers and families. And so, there's two competing considerations there. And so I would argue that, at the national level, the global level, things like the World Health Organization, that's the right venue to kind of make these difficult decisions around how do we make sure health resources are more evenly distributed at a global level. But at the individual level, everyone should have the right to make the best decisions for themselves.
Yeah, and also the World Health Organization is looking at it from a global recruitment process as well, ensuring that developing countries that are left behind with minimal resources are also supported in such a way that countries that have the means to support them back, either through technical skills development or other grant funding or scholarship, can continue to support and even out the brain drain in that developing country.
Exactly. So thank you, everybody. Let's go to Lourdes Moldry. We still have time for questions, right, Dr. Dia?
Yes, we have I know that this is just for 1 hour webinar, but because of some questions that are still important, we could probably extend it for another 5 minutes. And then the remaining questions, we could follow up through a frequently answered questions in our website.
All right, thank you. So Lourdes Mulder asks, can you give examples of dangerous working conditions that lead to breach of contracts for the newly arrived nurses? Anyone?
Yeah. So the number one is the staffing ratio and the poor orientation of the nurses. That is really one of the kind of scary, dangerous to the safety of patients. Both staffing, when you have 1:50, there is no quality. That's unsafe practice. And when you have poor orientation, when you don't know the policies of the institution that guides your practice, then that's really very dangerous.
Thank you, Dr. Beriones.
Next one is also from Lourdes, and I think to any of you would answer this. Do you have the information if union representations were available for some of these newly arrived Filipino nurses' breach of contracts, organization and state dependent? So I don't know if this is part of your survey, Attorney McCall, during if those nurses that are surveyed that were doing breach of contract, were they represented by a union?
So in most cases, they were not, right? So the way the model works is most nurses coming to the US are working under staffing firms. David had mentioned some who might go through the placement firm route as well, but the vast majority going through staffing firms. So that means even if there's a union that represents nurses in their organization, these staffing firm resources are employed directly by the staffing firm and then are contracted out to the hospitals. And so that's some of the reasons, we've worked closely with unions who are kind of very skeptical of this model because, there isn't union representation for those workers. Often foreign educated nurses like Filipino nurses will be part of a union later once they're directly employed by the hospital, but during their first few years when they're under the staffing firm, they are not allowed to have union representation under that model.
Thank you, Attorney.
Thank you, Mukul. The next question is an immigration question. So if you have a tourist visa, May Pasqua asks, is it possible to find a facility or hospital to sponsor you? If anyone is willing to answer, we could always save this for the FAQs. Next, M.
Next is from Angela Stevens. Does PNAA have the ability to anticipate the nurses who are incoming so as to educate them the important details? So yes, PNAA is actually, I'll just throw in my answer to this. PNAA is involved with the post-arrival orientation with Polo. So we do know, but we don't have a list of nurses coming, but I don't know who would have the list of nurses other than Polo.
So just to clarify and give a context, particularly for those that are recruited from the Philippines, they a list and anticipate these nurses that are coming. That's how the post-arrival orientation seminar is being provided in collaboration with Polo. However, there are other pathways of migration where these nurses are recruited directly from other parts of the world. For example, UK, Middle East. Polo doesn't have a record of that because they are not leaving from the Philippines. So the list might not be accurate in terms of the number of Filipino nurses that are migrating here. And this is why policies are being facilitated so we could provide that outreach and hopefully include them in those post-arrival orientation.
Thank you, everybody. I believe we have reached the end of our time. Dr. Dia? We will address the rest of the questions in the FAQ that will be distributed to everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Emily, let's take a picture of all of us, please.
So before we end, I would like to thank our excellent speakers. Thank you so much for volunteering your time, especially at 10:15 Eastern Time. And we hope to hear more from you and continue this collaboration together with PNAA. And thank you for all the attendees that have joined us. Please note that there will be an evaluation feedback that will be emailed to you. And our next webinar will be scheduled on March 2, 2023 at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So watch out for it, as our communications chair, Carol Robles, will be publishing this for our social media. Have a good evening, everyone, and good morning to Philippines.
Could you stay, please? And then we'll get.
Carol is taking a photo.